This famous photograph, Pavo Real del Mar, 1939, or Peacock of the Sea. A fisherman is casting a nearly all-encompassing net out over the ocean from a small boat. The fisherman's posture suggests that such an act requires athletic technique, but it is the net itself that is alive, completely splayed, the plumes of a peacock. It is at once lush and entirely mundane, charged with a feminine precision. Looking again, it is a monstrous, translucent hibiscus, there we go, blooming from his palm. And then it is a giant gramophone, for there is sound coming from this image, playing what must be Maria Callas, a sound both mournful and grand. Maybe I'll just start over as we have the image up. So that is the image. In Leo Matisse's famous photograph, Pavo Real del Mar, 1939, a fisherman is casting a nearly all-encompassing net out over the ocean from a small boat. The fisherman's posture suggests that such an act requires athletic technique, but it is the net itself that is complete, that is alive, completely splayed, the plumes of a peacock. It is at once lush and entirely mundane, charged with a feminine precision. Looking again, it is a monstrous translucent hibiscus blooming from his palm. And then it is a giant gramophone, for there is sound coming from this image, playing what must be Maria Callas, a sound both mournful and grand. Matisse was from Aracataca, Colombia, Marquez's Macondo, and my great-grandfather Esmeraldo Guerrero was likely from somewhere in or near that region in Colombia, or maybe the border at Venezuela. The net is a blown sail to take him, as the family story goes, from Colombia to Venezuela to Trinidad. Maybe this is Gory, as he was called, for he was a fisherman after all. Not the star at the bow, but the shadowed figure holding the oar, steadying the boat at the stern. The picture is happening before our eyes in media res, a photo in the infinitive. We are witnessing Matisse's genius, patience, and composition so masterly that it seems entirely natural. It's an instant of elevation that we are meant to forget is utterly ordinary, lit by divine alignment and un coup de dé. I love Matisse as I love Matisse. There is a cast net of Matisse's lens, the net too of my eyes, and the fisherman is caught like a fish in the flash. But who is really caught? It nearly seems that the net is being flung at Matisse, at my face, punishment for looking. That which the net is truly flung for is beneath the sea and not yet reached in the photo. The self, a shoal of fish. And where is home again? And what is home? Even the word's etymology is widely disputed. Even home doesn't have a home. Etymology masked as a kind of science of language, but it is more like poetry in that it is sonic and speculative, always about relation. Etymology is more of an itinerary than a history, not a planned route, but, to go back to the word's roots in the Latin itinerarium, an account of a journey. The dictionary speculates the roots of home in Old English, ham, dwelling place, house, abode, fixed residence, estate, village, region, country. From the Proto-Germanic heimas, home, source also of Old Frisian hem, home, village, Old Norse hemer, residence, world, Heimat, home, Danish, Hegem, Middle Dutch, Heim, German, Heim, home, Gothic, Heims, village. From the Proto-Indo-European to koimo, suffix form of root to kai, to settle, dwell, be home, as an adjective from 1550s. The old Germanic sense of village is preserved in place names and in hamlet. Home is a word almost entirely made by the long O, perhaps the most important vowel in Anglophone poetry. That O is omission and infinity, circle unbroken, moan, cry, invocation, calling into relation. It is the sound of address. It says, we do not live in this world alone. We bear gifts to the O in home, set flowers off in it in remembrance. Things and people are burnt there as the gods instructed. The O can never be emptied or filled. Home, shame, poem. In that Robert Frost poem, he says, home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. And also that home is something you somehow haven't to deserve. But I'm not sure. Isn't it something that home and poem rhyme? Home and poem are fraternal twins. And that reminds us that home requires poesis, that it's a thing to be made. Years and years ago, when I was struggling, like so many people, with not feeling at home anywhere, a friend said to me, no one has a home, you make a home. For whom is home not a troubled thing? We are always running away from or towards home, or both at once. The Constitution of the Trinidad and Tobago Bahamian Society. The name of the organization shall be the Trinidad and Tobago Bahamian Society. The objects of the society shall be, if you could put the Trinidad and Tobago Society picture, sorry, to promote and foster closer ties between the people of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and the people of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, to assist citizens of Trinidad and Tobago in the process of integration within the Bahamian community, to promote opportunities for greater social contact among citizens of Trinidad and Tobago resident in the Bahamas, to raise money in order to assist citizens of Trinidad and Tobago within the Commonwealth of the Bahamas who may be in need, to raise money for the support of charitable causes and or charitable institutions within the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and or in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago or elsewhere, to raise money to do all such other lawful things as are necessary for the said object and to provide other advantages and benefits associated with such a society. 1. Membership in the society shall be open to citizens of Trinidad. Colin Davis, Pam Lewis, Alicia Oxley, who's in the audience, the late Joey Alfred, and then my mother, who's in the audience, Helen Campbell, and then the late Percy Campbell, and then I think that's Joyce Thomas and Winston Thomas. We would drive over the Paradise Island Bridge to Maracas for the regular beach lime every local holiday or on Independence Day with at least one iron pot in tow. Mummy brought pilau, Auntie Pearl or Mrs. Lewis brought roti, Auntie Angela brought curry, and Mrs. Lewis again for sweetbread. Sometimes someone brought chow or tamarind ball or a couple packs of kurma. Or perhaps I am conjuring this part because I love Kerma, which all memories should have. Who brought the music? Alicia? Susan? Mr. Seville? Music, always music to rock us sideways across time and space. I remember there was often a big man on the shore, half cut, enjoying the sound of his own cuss, a big man being gently reminded of the children. He could have been a judge or a teacher or a police, this big man holding forth in ways he normally would not, being in other people's country after all. We would drive over the Paradise Island Bridge to Maracas was a lie of a line, since there was no bridge to Maracas. How could this have been Maracas Bay? The sand was whiter, the sea was bluer, and almost a sailing brightness. There were tourists everywhere, there were less waves, there were no mountains, no bacon shark. This was Nassau, not Trinidad. The mountains here were hotels. Mr. Thompson posted up the sign and Cabbage Beach became Maracas Bay. You could write things and they could be so. A game I came to learn. Everything everyone was made. We were all Trinbagonians, people from Trinidad and Tobago or TNT, Trini-Trinis, Trini-Bahamians, Trinis of a sort, Tobagonians, Tobagonian Bahamians, and even Bahamians who love Trinbagonians. When we weren't gorging ourselves on roti, which was our small life's delight, Carlisle and I would knock about with the other kids, swimming and toasting in the sun. Some of us were born in the Bahamas, some were born in TNT, a few elsewhere still. Some of us had papers, some did not. Some never got, but there was nothing to explain there on the beach since everyone knew exactly who we were in all our parts. It was a place you could be many things at once. There were endless fetes at the Lewis House or the Davis House or over the bridge by Mr. Thompson, where we would laugh at the big people and their homesick winery. Christmas time was for Junkanoo and Parang limes. When I was meant to be bored and playing with the other kids, I was watching the big people. Auntie Pearls sang in Spanish in a bright soprano. It was an ancestral language I was just beginning to learn. Mr. Alfred and Joe Lade played cuatro. I watched their hands work the cuatro like thrashing fish. Somebody played box bass, and somebody played maracas, and somebody danced. Later on, the Homers, who were a musical family, took over the parang. They were pumpkin vine cousins from the Cocopayo line. Who knew if this was culture or country? For we did things that I never did in Trinidad itself. But it was people surviving, and that was liberty, and that was life. To be native and foreign to myself. A self could be foreign, a foreigner, which is what we were called sometimes. There was the Christmas ball and the Old Year's Night ball. There was the International Cultural Fair and Diwali. There was the Army of Aunties. The Trinidad and Tobago Bahamian Society died down eventually. People moved, got tired, cussed and fell out, but it could not last, for the Trinidad and Tobago Bahamian Society was my childhood, my myth. So I'm sort of trying to make some connections here. So the title of my talk, which is The Impatriots, is a word that I've been carrying around with me for about 5 years now. And in some ways it's a kind of picong or play against expatriate, which comes with these colored and class assumptions, right, about who is an expat and who is an immigrant. So the word impatriot for me is kind of a response to becoming a writer. So when I became a writer, I had the strange experience, and I published a book. I had the strange experience of people deciding on my identity for me, including publishers. So I read in a festival that was the cultural part of the 2012 Olympics in London, which sort of set itself up as an Olympic-style festival of writers where a writer would be chosen for each country, so we would represent one country like an athlete. And which was a really, really strange experience for someone like me who has multiple identities or multiple places that they call home. And when I went to that festival, which was one of the strangest experiences of a reading that I've ever had, I met writers who were representing India and Sri Lanka and Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria and Hong Kong. And so many of them had this similar experience where they were located in multiple places at once. Most of them, to be honest, weren't even living in the countries that they represented. So in some ways, I'm responding to that, and I'm responding to the assumptions in Caribbean literature itself that I think that publishers, academics, and sometimes the writers themselves, but less so, hold up, which is the assumption of a kind of singularity of national identity, or that a literary work should stands for or represents a single nation in a discrete way. And it was always something that was bizarre for me, not only for my own experience, but for what I write. And so I was trying to think about a word and trying to extend the conversations about migration and diaspora that dominate literary and cultural conversations. As Professor Raming said, one who talked about himself as one who left this country, a hot country, and moved to a cold first world country, the US. And so when people use the word diaspora, this is what they mean. An artist or a writer who has moved from a hot third world country to a cold first world country. And so in some ways, what I want to do in this conversation that I really want to have with you tonight is to interrupt those assumptions and to think about, well, what does it mean for those for whom belonging in a singular way is impossible or is a problem, right? What does it mean for those whose transnationalism does not rely on snow? Right? And I know there are many in the room like that, many in this country, many in Trinidad, right? That what I want us to think about is that what does it mean to think about multiplicities or multiple identities that are made by moving between the region itself or between other so-called countries of the global south. And there's a whole archive of artists and writers and thinkers who move in this, what I think of as an awkward way or this illegible way against the grain of dominant notions of migration and identity and diaspora. And so in some ways, the word impatriate is my way of playing with those ideas and in a way, my way of sort of coming up with a name for these identities that are sort of left out of the larger conversation of migration or the larger conversation of cultural hybridity. So I think about artists and writers like Unia Kempadu, John Beadle, Janine Antoni, Robert Antoni, Lalawati Manu Raming. How do we actually think about these writers? Lalawati Manu Raming is going to be reading in the Bahamian Writers reading tomorrow, and she's born in Trinidad and moved here and is married to a Bahamian. How do we think about her work and what she writes? What does it mean to think about the artists that I'm going to focus on for a bit next, that I've been writing about quite a bit? An artist like one of the major modern American artists, which is Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was born in the US in New York to a Haitian father and a Puerto Rican mother, but also lived in Puerto Rico. How do we think about the complexity of his identities, and also what does he do with that loneliness and with that hybridity? How does he use it is what I'm trying to sort of push us to think about. And so for me, Impatriot is about troubling boundaries. It's about whereas expatriates, the short would be expats, impatriots, the shortened version would almost be imps, as in devils, right? Some devils, which is also a carnival character, but a kind of subjectivity that makes mischief with borders, right? Which troubles borders and conventional ways of knowing. So if I could just get Irony of a Negro Policeman. And this was, for those who don't know, Jean-Michel Basquiat was also one of the artists in the quote-unquote group of 27, like Jimi Hendrix, Amy Winehouse, these sort of great figures who died tragically at the age of 27. He died in, I think, 1988. And so his life was, and his sort of rise to fame was extremely fast in some ways. So in terms of black artists in the US, that he was the first black artist to get to become an art star, to get the kind of major institutional support from mainstream kind of galleries and art collectors. And that doesn't mean there weren't great black artists before him. Romare Bearden comes to mind as an amazing, one of the great American artists, but he was not taken up by the mainstream art world in the way that Basquiat was. So Basquiat painted this image in 1981, which was a period of incredible productivity for him. A lot of the most famous images, the sort of splishy, splashy neo-expressionist images came out of this period of 81, 82. If you could just move to the next Basquiat image. So I just want to show you the difference. So this was the original, and then you'll get to see what the final version of this image, which again is called Irony of a Negro Policeman. Thank you. Is it? Thank you. Fantastic. So that's the final image. And so, you could sort of see what happened there in the process between that original draft and the final. But what I want to say about this image is that it has been coming up again in the last 5 years frequently in social media and on the internet as a kind of movement meme of Black Lives Matter, right? In the wake of the extreme visibility of racial terrorism and Black death in the United States, that people have been invoking this image to think about the kind of terror and irony of this particular moment, right? So, as you can see in Basquiat's style, that incorporates both an engagement with canonical Euro-American art history, but also, sort of African and Caribbean visual languages, and I'm going to talk more about that, but also in US popular culture, like cartoons. So his style was deliberately, childlike. It was about preserving a particular kind of rawness and a particular kind of energy. So one of the things that he is known for was his use of text as well as image. So you can't see it clearly, but the word, so he has irony sort of scribbled there and circled, and then below it he has irony of a Negro policeman, but what he does with the word policeman is almost like in Wheel of Fortune, where you take out the vowels, like disemvoweling the word except for the E. So it sort of adds a poetic ambiguity. So the word could also be placement, irony of Negro placement, right? And then even more ambiguous, and when we go down, is that word that looks like paw or pawn, right? So it could either be paw and it says left, right? So he's really obsessed with labeling. He was, an influential text for him was Gray's Anatomy. So he's obsessed with sort of labeling the body, but so he's playing with paw, but also pawn, right? The idea that a black subject who is complicit with the kind of terrorism and extermination of other black people, right? So he's talking about institutional complicity here, right? If we can imagine and think about, again, a black policeman killing a black person in the US. This is the kind of reading that's come up. And the other thing I have to say is that there's another image called defacimento that's also been invoked in sort of Black Lives Matter images and conversations, because it was a memorial of a friend of his who was a graffiti artist who was killed by the police. And this shook him up incredibly. He said, it could have been me. So these are the kind of readings that are coming up in this painting. But what I want to think about is a new reading urged by my thinking of this idea of the impatriot, or a new kind of impatriot reading that then has to think about Basquiat's own complex cultural context as one who is Haitian, Puerto Rican, and American all at once. So in the way of background, his mother was Puerto Rican but was born in New York. His father was from a well-off Haitian family. His father's name is Gerard Basquiat, who was an exile from Haiti in the Duvalier regime. So this is, his father was someone, he passed away maybe under a decade ago, was someone who was exiled as a result of the corruption and terrorism in the Duvalier regime. And specifically, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Tonton Macoute, right, in Haiti. I'm sure you know. So the Tonton Macoute, which was founded by Papa Doc Duvalier in the 50s, the late 50s, was a kind of paramilitary, just ruthless paramilitary force that would wreak havoc, on any of his political enemies, but in Haiti on civilians, raping and killing. I'm sure, and I hope most of you have heard about, which is, as far as I'm concerned, legal terrorism. So this, to put it crudely, was the stripping of citizenship of Dominicans of Haitian descent and the deportation of Dominicans of Haitian descent. And so this image was profound for me, and again resonated with irony of a Negro policeman. And so in some ways, not only the visual critique, but also in terms of sound, where it makes me think then, what if I read, instead of reading Negro, that I read it in Spanish and read it as negro, right? And when I read it as negro, what happens is I'm called to the border, right? So the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And what we're seeing now is this kind of wall between a diaspora, an African diaspora, right? The Dominican Border Patrol Guard, who is Afrodescendiente, and these Haitians, or could be Dominicans of Haitian descent, on the other side, could either have been not let in or deported, right? And so what I'm saying here is I'm provisionally trying to start a conversation about how do we think multiple places at once? How do we question the boundaries, right? How do we question the boundaries of nation, right? So in some ways, what I'm also suggesting, particularly in this context, is for us to think carefully as the conversations constantly happen about Haitian Bahamians, right? And what for me is fascinating, it happened in a film, and it happens often, is the suggestion that Haitian Bahamians do not exist, that one is either Haitian or Bahamian. And I totally disagree with that. And so I want to challenge us as we think about these legal conversations that in some ways the critique here is in solidarity with Haitian Bahamians and thinking about how we are always creating identities that the state could never imagine. So while, that particular identity falls out of the legal terrain, that it actually exists, it requires a kind of ingenuity to create the spaces that have been created. So you have churches, you have, there are these really interesting radio stations where they are moving between Haitian Creole and Bahamian Creole and Standard English, and just moving all at the same time with that kind of multiplicitous fluency. So in some ways, so this is what I want us to think about, and what I'm pushing and critiquing in some ways, how Caribbean literature is written about, talked about, how we in the region talk about identity, how we talk about boundaries. And in some ways, it's also a kind of almost defense of my life. So I'll end there, and I really want to engage in conversation. Thank you.